Welcome to Talking China Business, a crayfish.io podcast on how to grow your business and succeed in the Chinese market. We delve into the practical issues, obstacles, solutions, and case studies about driving business growth in China. Here is your host, Ting Zhang, founder and CEO at crayfish.io.
Recently, lots have happened in the world, from the US trade war, tariff war against the world, to global stock market plunge. But today, we're going to just focus on Europe, UK, and China, where technology innovations meet and where markets and business meet. For today's podcast, I've got the great pleasure to have Pascal Coppens, international keynote speaker, China expert, best-selling author, YouTube influencer, as my guest. Hi, Pascal. Yes, I've been following you for a couple of years, until, of course, recently I met you in person in Brussels at the Chinese New Year reception. And I very much enjoy your video sessions on China innovation. And as an innovation expert at Networks, you are a sinologist, but you also refer yourself more as a die-hard China entrepreneur. So you have employed, partnered, and competed in China with hundreds of Chinese innovators over the last 25 years. So how did all this start?
Oh, it started a long time ago, but let's start from 1988, which is about 37 years ago, when I started studying Chinese in the university here in Belgium, Ghent. I'm from Belgium. And then from that, I started getting really interested in the country and the culture, and I visited the country a few times in early 90s. But then in 96, I studied in Beijing, and from 96 till 2017, most of the time I lived in China, most of it in Shanghai, some of it in Beijing. And for 20 years, I've been involved in the technology innovation industry in China, hardware, software, lots of things. So as you said, I've competed with many Chinese. I've partnered with many Chinese. It's been an up and down roller coasters, but it was very exciting to be in China at a moment where China was growing economically and technology in terms of technology. So I've been fortunate to be part of that growth.
Yeah, that's almost like time swapped. I left China in 1997 for Cambridge. After studying, I started, working in the city, then later setting up my own consulting business in Cambridge, and then advising companies to do business in China. So while you were building your career in China, I was building my career in the UK.
Yeah. And when I came back in 2017, I felt that not so much has changed in 20 years of leaving China. A few things did, but not just like the change that I've experienced in China. So I don't know how that was for you after 20 years going back to China, or if you have a different experience from your side. But
Well, yes, luckily for myself, because my work, the nature of my work, I've been going back to China every few months, since 2002, since I started my China consulting business at the time. So I was never away from China that long. So, but every few months, especially in the 2000s, every few months you go back to China, you saw so many changes, whether it's infrastructure or businesses, everything. And so definitely the last 2 decades or so in China has gone through a massive transformation. The country is very different from when I left it in 1997. In fact, recently I was in China until 2 days ago. I went on a business trip visiting 7 cities, and from the south, Shenzhen, Guangzhou, Dongguan, to north, which is Beijing, and then east, in Ningbo, Hangzhou, and west of the country, Chengdu. So so it's a, quick round trip. So when did you last visit China? I know that you've been doing quite a lot of travels.
Last time was November last year, 2024, and that was for a big conference, financial conference in Beijing, SWIFT conference, which was quite interesting to see how China has changed in a different way than people had experienced or thought so, because for 4 years or 3 years at least, China was closed off during the pandemic. And then when people went back, they had a different experience. In the mobility sector, electrical vehicles and so on, people had already in 2023 seen how much it changed. But in the financial sector, it took until 2024 for them to realize the big change that has happened. But no, this is all ongoing. What I found most surprising is in 2017 when I came back to Belgium and I started talking about China, is how little actually people understood what was happening in that country, and it hasn't gone better since. I think the knowledge of what's happening in China has actually not increased over the years, specifically since 2020.
That's very interesting, because later I would like to talk to you a bit and compare your observation of what Europe, is doing in terms of understanding China, in terms of, its own challenges, compare that with what I see in the UK. When I was in China recently, everyone every business person I met was talking about the trade war by the Trump administration. There are so many uncertainties in Europe, in China, and in the UK. But with our UK clients, they seem to be treating business as usual. What's the situation with Europe businesses, in your view?
Well, I think what I've experienced the past 3 months, definitely since Trump became president of the United States of America, I have seen a huge increase in interest in China, both from the media, which is quite unusual. I haven't seen that in 5 years, that the media suddenly wanted to know things about China again, but also in business people. Looking at going to China, I also very often go with business people to China to do innovation tours, we call that. It's basically to inspire them about technology and so on. And there've been a lot of uptake and interest in that. So the past 3 months, I've seen a big change. But I think it's partially to do with Trump. It's also partially to do with China itself, that has been very, I would say, bullish almost on the future since the 2 sessions, or at least not as negative about or cautious about the future. So they're much more convinced that they have this in their own hands. But this is also the result a little bit from internally in China that I've seen, because I'm watching innovation and technology very much from what happened with DeepSeek back in January and in December, and even before that with electrical vehicles, where it's very clear that European car manufacturers are now catching up in many places, in many cases, as opposed to be leading, which we are used to. And so in many industries, now you see the bio manufacturing happening, or a pharma industry. You see a lot of industries where industry by industry, they are starting to feel, oh, China's not behind anymore. And the government, as well as the people, the Chinese people, are starting to feel, well, this might be our moment. And now that, of course, Trump has changed the parameters of how the world is run, and he's kind of trying to rock the boat, China sees an opportunity. And I think a lot of people in Europe, which I talk to, are now, not that they're suddenly all going to jump and run towards China, but they're at least open to understand what's happening. And I haven't seen that in 5 years. So that's a big change.
Yeah, I certainly felt when I visited in Europe, I think in general, Europeans are more open to Chinese culture or Chinese visitors. For example, one I would say the example is the use of Chinese language signs in many of the European airports or public transportation. I've seen that. What's your observation in different attitudes or business practices towards China, doing business in China, engage with China, among the UK and European governments and companies?
Yeah, well, for the UK specifically, I can't talk too much about that market because it's not my expertise. If I look at the mainland Europe, and you can add UK to Europe if you want. That's even though we have Brexit, I think we are
Yeah.
still culturally very connected.
Yes.
I do believe that what the big difference is that now we are realizing that. The West, and when I talk about the West, I mean mainly Europe, America, and its allies, have failed in containing China in terms of technology. And because of that, I think many people are starting to wake up to the fact that just protectionism and just trying to contain China will not work. And they see more and more opportunities also that come out of China that they could address for their own market. And before, I mean, if we're honest, the European Union, but also the UK, has been following the US and Washington very much under Biden. Now that has changed a lot, and we're more and more talking about autonomy. I think that's where the difference between UK and the European Union is still a little bit more, that the European Union is still very much concerned about our autonomy, because we're not just dependent on China, we're also dependent on the US. And now suddenly we have two big global powers that are trying to make our life a little bit more difficult with trade wars and other influences that they have. So it's very clear for me that the European Union is trying to go for more autonomy. And the question is, how do you do that? And I think that's where they can either look at, maybe the US will all will be fine over time, but we need to build it from our own strength, or they can also use the strength of China in a way to build their own autonomy against anyone or for themselves in a way. And I see that if you look at the car manufacturers, it's very clear that they're now collaborating more and more with Chinese companies, because they've figured out that there's just no way to do it on their own. And so that reflection of suddenly understanding that we cannot do everything on our own, but at the same time we still have a lot of strengths that the world needs is a big change from before, where we were kind of like accepting that Washington was setting the rules, and we would accept that and deal with it in the same way, specifically versus China. So that's some of it.
Yeah, the last few months have changed enormously that dynamics, right? And talking about EV and AI, this time in my trip, I was very impressed. Every single car almost every single car I was driven in was electric, and they were all using voice recognition, AI commands. This, kind of use of technology, quick adoption of China is just amazing.
And I think that we are in Europe starting to realize that what we can get out of China is different from before. Where before it was a lot to do with just the supply chain, and maybe we could sell things to the Chinese because we had better products at that time. And now, as you say, it's a lot more about new trends. That new trends are not coming out of Silicon Valley or London or Brussels, but they're actually coming out of Beijing or Shanghai or China in general. Yeah. And I think that's the big trends, is one of the big new things that we're not used to, that global trends are coming out of China. And it's also to do with the Chinese companies that have not been very global until now. Many companies, except for companies like Huawei and Lenovo, many of them were mainly focused on their internal market. But now, with TikTok, with Temu, with all these, if you look at JD coming up and many products that are so fantastic in China, and specifically with the AVs these days, electrical vehicles, we're now seeing them, and people are starting to realize, wow, this is a user experience that I'm not used to, and actually it fits my lifestyle as well. It's not because it's China made that it's actually culturally only for Chinese. It's for humans. It's for people.
Yes, I agree. I think I could say that the Chinese companies' innovation based on human needs is more advanced. I think based on consumer needs, they basically drive the needs of, for example, the use of AI, things like that. And you talked about, Europe used to just look at China, maybe first as a market, then supply chain. In terms of the technology side, what do you think, because China is now becoming a superpower, does China still need Europe or UK, in fact, for technology, or do you think it can be sufficient?
Well, it's the answer is double. It's a yes and a no. What it means is that you could put that question also towards the US and ask, does the US still need Europe for technology? And the answer is yes. And that same answer is for China for the same reasons. One of the big companies in UK was DeepMind, and that was sold then to Google. But the origin and the ideas came from the UK, and we have in Belgium and in Europe many of these brightest academics and engineers coming up with great stuff, from chips to pharmaceuticals. I mean, anything in medical field and so on. But very often the problem is scaling it to bring real value for companies, and that's where the US is good, and also China is very good at. And so will they still need us? Well, if you ask the question, does the US still need technology from Europe? The answer is yes. Does China still need technology for Europe? The answer is also yes, because it's the same reason. Without it, they cannot scale. The question is more, how does Europe still need China? And what is the win-win that we can achieve? That's the bigger question. And I think what we are underestimating, in my view, is how much Chinese are actually looking at Europe from a pretty positive point of view, specifically now with the geopolitical tensions, looking at it from quality, from efficiency, from really deep research and academics and education. And so I think we are underestimating our own strengths that the Chinese see and we often don't. And so as long as they see that, and I don't see any reason after thousands of years of cultural history in Europe that this will go away any day soon, I do believe that we will always be valuable for any superpower, whether it's the US, China, India, or even Europe in the future again. That's all fine. So I think there's a lot of opportunity still. I do believe that Europe doesn't see all the opportunities that China can offer yet. And I think it's not about the dependency, but more about the innovation that China brings. I think it's about the talent that China has today, specifically in the technology field, and also the new trends that China is coming up with. But also, I think Asia is the growth market for the world. And so China is at the center of this growth market. So I feel there's a lot of things that we can get from, or that Europe can get from China. And of course, we do have some common agenda. If you think about sustainability or climate change, and we do have commonality, or that we want to keep diplomacy still alive and the international institutions still running. I think that's where Europe and China find each other, and the US and China not so much. The US and Europe also not so much lately. So I think there's commonality.
Yeah. Of course, as you know, China has this industry policy that wherever it's possible, it would not like to rely on the West. That is, whether Europe, including UK, or US. And with the recent, years of US ban on, tech ban on China, China was forced to develop its own semiconductors, and of course now AI. China is almost as much advanced as the West. But as you also talk about, I think in your book, Can We Trust China? Your book is titled that. And there's an uncomfortable feeling about China's rising in the world innovations, mainly because people were not able to trust China. So you offer a different view on the country in transition. So can you tell us a bit more about your book?
The book was written during the pandemic. In 2022, it came out. And when we say, can we trust, the we is, of course, Western. It was written for Europeans and Americans, but mostly Europeans. And the reason I wrote the book was because many people started to distrust China a lot since the pandemic. And it was, I believe that the biggest issue is that we are having a narrative for many, many years about China, which is partially, there's things that are correct. Some things are not factual. But then the question is, do we actually know how China itself views the world and how China views itself? And I think unless we understand how China views the world and China views itself, I don't think we can trust China in any way. And I think I wanted to change that. So I wanted to change that with the book by giving a double lens on every challenge that we have with China. So there's a lot of questions that we have on China, or things that we distrust in some way, whether it's from a political point of view or whether it's from a company point of view or even from a people point of view. But then how does China work? And I've given a double lens to understand also how the Chinese feel about these things. But on top of that, I've also given an upside down view of China. Instead of looking at it always from top down, Beijing making decisions and the rest of the population following these decisions blindly without asking questions, I have put that whole paradigm upside down because that's been my experience, where it's much more decentralized than we believe, much more autonomous in the way that people have autonomy to make their own decisions, and that the real power of China is from the entrepreneurs. It's from the people that build things, that buy things, that are curious, that want to move forward, that see the future. And so this was it's a more positive view on China if you look at it from the bottom up. It's a more negative view on China if you look at it from the top down. And the question is, which of those two is using the other? And I believe that without the power of the population, that Beijing would not have the power that they have today to create what they do. And so that's been my book about. So a lot about culture and about understanding the way of how the collective and the individual and things like that differ from the West, but also some of the things that are paradoxes, which we don't always understand. Is China state-driven or is it market-driven? I mean, maybe it's both. There's a lot of hybrid in China. And I think that's where I call that the qubit mindset in my book, which is don't think in binary like black or white, but think in any possibility between yes and no could be endless. And that's kind of how I experience China, with a lot of examples in the book so people understand it very easily what it means.
That's great. I think people do need a lot of examples, real examples, to understand those seemingly quite conflicting concept, right? Because, collectivism versus individualism. I haven't written a book, although maybe when I retire, I will write one. But I've been holding workshops for clients for nearly 20 years to talk with them about Chinese culture, understand what's the cultural implication for doing business, why, Chinese people would behave a certain way, why would they think differently, and what can you do to relate to them and engage them better, make, your business partners friends and vice versa. And of course, there are still problems facing Western companies in China on day-to-day business. What are your experience or observations of those problems, particularly for the European companies?
Well, the problems for European companies are quite broad. The difference is that when I was in China last century and the beginning of this century, there was a lot of problems also dealing with China, but the problems were very different. Very often it was a lack of regulation and a lack of agreements, and so now we have too many of these in China, and the issue is that people were complaining back then that there was not enough. Now they're complaining that there's too much. So I think the whole landscape of China in a business sense has changed tremendously. And just like everything has changed in China, also the way of doing business has changed. And what I mean by that is that the local companies are much more competitive. They also have to, the people are also more and more in the middle class, meaning they want better wages. They want a different expectation in terms of work and life balance. They want their kids and Gen Zs, they want maybe just experiences and not to work anymore. In some cases, they can afford it because their parents work really hard. And so there's a lot of transformation that happened in the country. And I always have the impression that we accept that China changes in Europe, but that we don't accept that China has the same type of different expectations for themselves. And that means that there's a different framework that is needed to make that happen and to protect the people, the workers, the privacy, all these things that we believe China never had is now there, and it doesn't always suit us. So for many businesses, European businesses, I feel that the biggest challenge dealing with China, besides the political challenge, is that they feel that China has become as difficult as Europe to deal with. And then the question is, if it's as difficult, and then why go to China? Why invest in China? Because then you might as well stay in Europe. So there's no more incentive for many new companies or small companies to risk going to China, because besides all that same environment that you have in Europe, on top of that, you have the political risk that everybody talks about, and you have the very tough competition. And so what I see is that people and companies that trust that China will to remain or maintain being the engine of growth for Asia and for many places in the world are people that are looking at the new China and not at the old China. And so if you look at the new China, you look at aspirations, you look at what the Chinese want for their future, you look at the fact, as we said before, that they have really great talent and don't want to just build capacity and quality and at bottom prices, but they now want to disrupt with innovation and disrupt markets with customer experiences and with different environments. And I think if you look at that aspirational China, specifically from the younger generation, it's a very different way of looking at China. And that attracts some companies, that attracts the companies that have already been successful in China, because they are familiar with that transformation. The bigger ones specifically, if you look at American companies like Apple or Nike, I mean, they can't just go away. I mean, Trump would like them to go away, but it's not going to be so easy because there's a huge market. Yeah. But even European companies, I mean, German companies that were investing big into China because they have been there and they know they need this more than just the market. They actually need to get things. So I think many traditional companies that have been successful in China, they understand that it's not about getting resources in terms of products, but getting resources in terms of talent, in terms of innovation, in terms of trends. And that's good. And then there's the smaller companies that see that China is really a more mature market. And that means that if they bring services or they bring know-how or they bring anything that is in high demand in the Chinese market, there is an opportunity if you want to do that, because the Chinese consumers are very much eager to adopt new things, regardless whether it's Chinese or non-Chinese. If they have a choice and the price is better, of course they're going to go for Chinese. But if it's better European or Western products, I mean, or services, they will still consider those. So I think it's about, sometimes I feel we're back into the 90s, where it's the people who dare to look long term and want to have the adventure that are going back to China, and everybody else is scared and say, no, it's not good enough. It's dangerous. Let's not do that.
Yes, absolutely. I was in Dongguan, I mentioned a few weeks ago, and Dongguan used to be the world's a workshop, right? Everything seems to be made in Dongguan.
But it used to be products, but now it's smart products. And I think that's the big difference.
Yeah, but there's also a lot of factories vacant at the moment because some big companies, finding it hard to compete in China anymore, particularly because, as you said, the Chinese company are making things cheaper and with a similar functionality. And so there's a lot, there's some, Western manufacturers left China, but also Chinese companies are moving out to Southeast Asia to take advantage of lower cost there, because in China, the labor cost is no longer cheap for manufacturing. But this particular kind, we helped to set up this assembly in China, exactly grasped the opportunity of a particular model they have in China, simply because they just cannot sell that product from outside China into China, because the Chinese market just can't accept that price. So, but there's still opportunity for them for this particular model. So that's why they set up the factory in China using the local manufacturing talent near Dongguan, but also managerial talent to particularly produce this model just for the Chinese market. And they see a big potential for that. And I totally agree with you also on the talent as well. When I was there, I also, my company Crayfish, we helped the client recruit the manufacturing manager. So I attended the interviews with the client, and the people who came through the shortlist are very good qualification. They were West educated, worked in the Filtronics, Apple, and Chinese companies, spoke very fluently, and yet they're looking, for new opportunities, and they're looking to find aspirational jobs. But of course, on the other side, you can also say that because the manufacturing activities in Dongguan has decreased over the last year, so there's more talent available. And, so they are very good resources for European and UK companies when they wanted to increase their market share in China. But for those already doing business in China, like you mentioned, the German companies, they made money in China, and they're not worried. They're more keen to expand their market in China, I guess, while some other Western companies leave.
Yep, 100% agree. And I think more and more people will start to realize that China is a market of new opportunities, not the same as opportunities before, but it's also a fitness center, meaning that you have to go to China to stay fit, meaning if you're not in China, you might get disrupted in your own market because the Chinese are coming to the world. And so if you want to be close to what's happening, where all the action is, it's better and better to be close to China, because otherwise you might become the battlefield instead of being part of the action.
And it's already happening. I mean, Most of the Chinese companies I talked to this trip are looking at expanding internationally. In the Chinese, they call 出海, which means, going out, going abroad, right, going overseas. And I'm witnessing more opportunities for European or UK companies to partner with Chinese companies in that sense, sure. Whether accepting the Chinese company as a strategic investor or exiting, finding a Chinese company that buys them and take them, grow them more in China. The Chinese companies seem to be more keen in that model now compared to before. But of course, not as crazy as 10 years ago when Chinese companies just buy any company available. They are now more looking at, in their sector, They want to buy, for example, European brands that with distribution channels for their industry, or with good manufacturing facilities for them to sell in Europe, particularly in this recent tariff issues coming up. So what do you see in this trends in Chinese companies coming this way too?
No, I think this is the big trend that is going to happen. I see it every day, but it's not. I mean, very often we believe that it's because the economy is doing bad in China or because there's a trade war happening that the Chinese are now going to dump all their products into Europe. I see it very different. I think the reason that the Chinese are going global is because right now they feel that in China they're able to outcompete global companies. And if they're able to outcompete their global competitors in China, then why not go global? Because you can outcompete them anywhere in the world. And so it's not so much a reaction towards a problem, but the fact that they have realized that their quality and their products and their services and support and everything else is actually at the same level as it is in the rest of the world, specifically in Europe or the US. And so I think they're going to go more and more global. I'm convinced of it. I see it every day. But I also agree with you. It's more and more strategic. And it's not just like crazy, the Wild West, go West type of strategy from before. Right now, most Chinese companies are doing their homework. They are also working with European or global communication and marketing experts, and so it's not just them on themselves trying to make a buck. It's more a long-term planning. And Europe, of course, is one of the most attractive markets from a short-term perspective for sure. Longer term, Asia and other places in the global south are very interesting. But on the short term, and short meaning 5 to 20 years, it's definitely Europe a very attractive market, simply because we have customers. We are customers that are willing to pay for that quality and willing to pay for what the Chinese now have. So I think it's only going to increase. And I think as I often say, we've only seen the tip of the iceberg. What is really going to happen is not just the big companies, which we all know now, or we know at least many, but the medium-sized companies and even smaller Chinese companies willing to risk going to Europe because they are convinced that they have something that they can sell. And that was not the case 10 years ago.
Yes, I also have been talking to, smaller Chinese companies from, whether it's renewable materials or a medical device and pharmaceutical as well. So these are no longer, those leading champions. They are just, companies in the middle.
They're hidden champions, we call them. But yeah. And I really think the world is changing when it comes to that. And I do believe that we will start to realize that these Chinese companies have a lot to offer. And so they will come more and more. And what they didn't have 10 years ago was champions, whether it's hidden or visible champions that were successful in Europe. There was very few Chinese companies that could really say, "Oh, we've done a perfect run in Europe, and here's the blueprint. Just copy what we did, and you'll be successful in Europe." I mean, Huawei had a lot of challenges. If you see it, I mean, they were successful, but with a lot of backlash. If you see most companies, even Alibaba and so on, it's been a roller coaster for many of these Chinese companies, and very few can really say, "Oh, we've been doing really, really well." I think maybe DJI with the drones have been the best out of all, and or maybe higher with the white goods. So there are some good examples, but there's like 10 good examples. And now what we see is that every year there's 3, 4, 5 more examples that are becoming successful in Europe. And the more ambassadors that China has and examples of successes, the more other Chinese companies are going to want to copy that model and say, "Oh, if that company, BYD can do it or XPeng can do it, then maybe we can do it too.
Yeah, definitely. About 15 years ago, on behalf of a client, I actually did some research on Huawei, why it was so successful. And of course, they have gone through a lot of learning curves themselves. With now the smaller Chinese companies, they are able to draw upon those lessons and learn. And also the big players like Huawei, like Haier, they are taking their supply chains and help them either way. They help the UK supply chains into China. They help, the Chinese supply chain into Europe. So these are all happening. And so finally, I have a question for you. If you had a crystal ball to look into, what do you think Europe-China trade relation would be like in 5 years' time?
Okay, well, my job is looking at my crystal ball every day. But let's say that it's really difficult to predict these days the Europe-China relationship simply because the US-Europe relationship is kind of rocky in itself. So it's unpredictable how the US-Europe relationship will continue. Will Trump get his way and will we accept it, or will he fail and will we have to reinvent ourselves, or will it be something in the middle? Nobody really knows. So I think the China-Europe relationship is defined a lot by the US-Europe relationship these days. But if you disregard that, I think there's a few things that definitely Europe now sees, as we discussed before, as new opportunities in China. They were more open to look at China. And because the business community will look more at China, the politicians will have to follow some way. Because if the politicians won't follow, there's going to be an internal fight between businesses and politicians, and that's never a good idea. But it's also what I see is that Europe, because of this whole transformation of the world in itself, is looking more and more at new markets. And it's not about China. It's not about the US. It's really about the other markets. And you see that the European Union, for example, been to India. You've seen a lot of places where they go
Asian
now.
Countries.
Asia. But also, I mean, you'll see Africa, Middle East. I mean, there's a lot of things that are happening. So China for a decade has been very focused on the global South. With the Belt and Road Initiative, but also with individual companies going specifically to Asia and the Middle East. What you will see now is that Europe is also going to try and do that. And what they will find is that the Chinese have already been there before them. Yes. And because they will find that and they will figure that out, they will have to make the choice: do we compete with the Chinese in Vietnam or in Malaysia or in Indonesia, or are we going to partner with them? And I think that will not take long before they figure out that competing will not be the best option in many cases, because they will have to use their supply chain and so on, and maybe other instruments. So I think that that is one thing. The other thing that I see is that the world order is starting to shift. And I don't want to go too geopolitically, but if we look at the multipolar world that is often talked about it, as opposed to the unipolar world where the US is in command, is something that many countries in the global South have been talking about. And we see now that China, who's also been in favor of this multipolar world order, is now being supported more and more by the European Union, that sees that happening as well. And so I believe, and I feel that if I have a crystal ball, that Europe will start accepting that the world cannot be led only by the US anymore. And this will go fast. And Trump is doing that extremely fast. And that doesn't mean that they're going to let go of the US, definitely not, and specifically not in the UK. I mean, we just can't. Also in terms of military and other reasons. I mean, we have no cloud computing, we have no technology, there's a lot of things we don't have without the US. But I do believe that from an opportunity and an investment point of view, looking more at upcoming nations outside of China is where Europe will find China in its way. And so there's the kind of solidarity now. So the interesting thing about this trade war is that in America, there's a lot of people that kind of are pro-Trump or not pro-Trump, but even those who are not for him have kind of this feeling that he might be doing something good for the country, even if they don't support him. It's kind of like their hope that somehow it will be okay. And I think in Europe we have the same towards China now, where we don't really trust 100%, but we are pretty. We have kind of a feeling that what China is doing towards Trump is something that many people would like Europe to do as well, but is not doing. Stand up against Trump is something that I feel is a new game, and it's also something that China has been playing very tough the last. And so there's a secret aspiration or feeling that this is not bad. So we are looking in a more positive way because China dares to stand up against the US. And as long as we were not the target in Europe of the US, we didn't care about it, that China and US were having tough fights. Today, it's a very different story.
Yes.
So this is, it's wicked, but it's a reality.
Yes. Who would have imagined that US is taking on Europe, and even UK is not, excluded from the tariff wars. And, of course, I'm very encouraged to see that the UK, under the new Labour government, is making a lot more efforts to restore or re-engage China in a more positive way.
I also believe there's going to be business is going to be back, simply because right now it's a lot of emotions, but people are looking for opportunities and ways to continue. But I think there's going to be a big difference in terms of China-Europe relations, in terms of the fact that we will need more and more innovation or seek more and more innovation coming from China, where before it was the opposite direction. And what China will seek more and more from Europe is mainly know-how and expertise, which is beyond the products and beyond the innovation that we had before. It's really the how to do things. This is about services. And this is something China did not need before that much because they were running it in their own way. But now they want quality services, and whether it's for retirement homes or it's for financial services I think the know-how is what we can offer to China now, while we will look more for the innovation. And before we were looking for products from China, and we were selling our innovation or products to China. And so I think this is turning a little bit the relationship in a different direction, which is good because ultimately Europe is mostly a service industry.
And the same with UK. Yeah, it's also a lot more services. Yeah, definitely. As I also noticed from my trips to China, the aging care, for example, market is huge. And there's a lot more money available to spend from the people who retired in their 50s, they are still, relatively young, and they've got money to spend. And there's a lot of opportunities for European and UK products and services. So while we're in the same business in a way that we help, the two sides business to succeed in each other's markets, hopefully, there will be a better opportunities for us and for us, and we can probably work together also on some exciting projects.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think there's a lot of things that are going to be positive, but it's also we have to get rid of the emotional stress that we have with the trade war, and I think that's and the real war in Ukraine, of course. So there's a few things that are really drawing us back or keeping us from engaging with anyone, including China. Yeah,
you'll probably another few months, hopefully.
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much, Pascal. That's really great discussion and conversation. I really enjoyed our conversation.
My pleasure.
Thank you for listening to our podcast, Talking China Business. If you like this podcast, subscribe, like, and share. We discuss all aspects of driving business growth in China. Your comments, suggestions and questions are always welcome. Do get in touch. Our website is www.crayfish.io, and our email address is hello@crayfish.io. You can find us on LinkedIn, YouTube, and X. It's crayfish.io.